I'm Andree Duggan with the Lafayette Historical Oral History Project, and I'm talking today with Bob Fisher. Today is Friday, May 28th, 2021, and I have to ask you, what is your full name and the spelling?
Robert M. Fisher without a C.
Do you have a nickname?
Bob.
All right, I got that part right. When and where were you born?
I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1938.
And how long have you lived in Lafayette?
Uh, I, we moved to Lafayette in the summer of 1966. We lived in Lafayette until the summer of 1985 when we had moved to Manhattan. When we returned from a career opportunity in Manhattan, we could not find a house in Lafayette. We ended up in Baja Lafayette. So we've lived in Orinda since 1985, 86.
Very good. What is it about Lafayette that prompted you to settle here in 1966?
Uh, Lafayette was as it still is today, a gorgeous, gorgeous community. Very convenient to Berkeley, where I was a professor. Uh, Great climate, great schools, all of the amenities that one would look for in a starter home for a young couple making an academic career at Berkeley.
That's wonderful. What were you doing at the time, and how did you become involved in your new community?
I was a professor of criminology. We had just been recruited by the University of California in 1965 from where I was with the British Home Office and the University of London. We had lived in a rented house in Berkeley for the first year while we decided whether we wanted to stay. Uh, so as soon as it was clear that we loved the area and I was enjoying the job, we started house hunting. We had an infant daughter, our first child at the time, and we fell in love with Lafayette.
That's wonderful. How many children did you have? How about if we start with your wife's name at the time and how many children you had together?
Um, my wife, Ellie, Dr. Eleanor Fisher, is still my wife after 62 years. And at the time we moved to Lafayette, we had a daughter who was a toddler. She wasn't even 2 years old at the time. We subsequently added a son. So our daughter's name is Lori. Our son's name is Jonathan.
Wonderful. Do you have any grandchildren?
Oh, yes, I've got three grandboys.
And I have to ask you, any great grandchildren?
Not yet.
Way too young for them. Um, can you discuss how you became involved in the community here for the cityhood, is it called, campaign?
Yes, uh, or the incorporation campaign.
The incorporation
Uh,
campaign, yeah.
I had no intention of becoming involved, uh, uh, but even after being here for a year or two, I was very involved as in leadership. I came from a family that had always been very active in community affairs and very active in philanthropy and in charitable involvement, so that uh, it was natural for me. I co-founded our first nonprofit in Berkeley just months after arriving here, the Suicide Prevention Center of Alameda County, which is now the Crisis Center, which was only the second in the United States. So I was already extremely involved in Berkeley. Uh, what happened was that a neighbor, Ann Brinkerhoff, and her husband Elmer, who lived off down below us on North Peardale Drive in Upper Happy Valley, came by the house to ask me to sign a petition for incorporation. Well, she bent my ear. And because I've been an activist, I had been president of my, the whole thing. I'd been president of my class in high school. I had been president of my 500-man residential college at Harvard. I often, almost always took leadership. I was the head of my high school fraternity. And so when Ann Brinkerhoff started talking to me about the pros and cons of incorporation, I just got interested. And I said, Ann, Ellie and I would be happy to help. Do what you're doing in the neighborhood. If there's anything we can do, all of this sounds like a great thing. We're brand new to the community. And so it happens. And that's how it happened.
Now, what was it when you arrived? I guess we were an unincorporated uh,
Area.
township, territory?
An unincorporated area of the county. And there were at the time only 13 cities in the county. The most recent incorporation, this was looking back from 1968, 66 actually, which was the start of the incorporation campaign, had been in 1958, about 8 years earlier in Pleasant Hill, the city of Pleasant Hill. So Contra Costa was still a much smaller population. At the time, we had a 500,000 or 600,000 population in Contra Costa County. We had tried once or twice previously to incorporate, but it had never happened because there's a certain amount of inertia, and people are afraid of property taxes and the cost of adding another level of administration as a trade-off for local control. But times were changing, and because of the growth of our business district during those years, a study by the local agency formation commission of the county, which determines all incorporations, of which I later became the chair in the mid-70s, the local agency formation commission studied Lafayette, and the determination was made that based upon our sales tax revenues in downtown, we could become a no property tax city, which is rare. But we would not need a property tax if we incorporated with a very, very frugal model of managing the city. So by 1968, conditions were changing. We believed we could sell the incorporation as a no property tax city. And we were being threatened increasingly by the pressures of growth, notably by the proposed completion of BART by 1970. And we were concerned about the impacts of BART on Lafayette growth. At the time, the general plan of the county showed Lafayette's population as being somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 to 65,000 people if we were built out in the zoning that the county saw for the future of Lafayette. That would have made us a fairly densely populated single family residential community. And we were very concerned about that.
Looking back now, you live in Lafayette. Oh, I need to ask you where you live because they like to know where people live within,
3932 North Peardale Drive.
and this is the same place you've lived the whole time?
It was where we lived until 1985.
Oh, okay. And so since then you are now at,
85 Southwood Drive in Orinda.
oh, you're in
But
Orinda.
which I call Baja Lafayette, a phrase I coined and which people chuckle at because of uh, the perennial uh, uh, competition among local communities.
You know, obviously, you love Lafayette. You were very involved. I'm sure you come here to have breakfast or to walk the reservoir. Um, looking back at those days and what you did with incorporation, um, how do you think that has helped Lafayette today?
It's a complicated question, but we're looking back at what, 53 years of retrospection. Um, from the campaign for incorporation itself, through the values that the first council brought to our new community, participation in Lafayette meant everything to us. We were, before incorporation and after incorporation, thanks to the mix we had in our first councils, dedicated to citizen participation. We generated 20 candidates for that first election. Every one of those candidates was a yay sayer. There wasn't a single naysayer in the group of 20 candidates. We had one or two who were ambivalent and who were sort of gray on the issue of incorporation. But most of these incorporation campaigns attract somebody who's going to snipe at the incorporation. We really had a cheerleading bunch. And those of us, like myself, who are very loud cheerleaders, could easily out cheer the occasional person who might snipe at the idea of incorporation. When we incorporated, uh, participation was incredible in the campaign. The vote was really wonderful. We really did get out the vote. And uh, we we won by a considerable margin. Some of the first things that first council did was to involve citizens. Within 2 or 3 months, we created the BART Commission, chaired by Gordon Holmes, my colleague, good colleague, the late Dr. Gordon Holmes, who had been the second highest vote getter in the campaign. Uh, and that was to respond to what the impacts would be of the opening of BART on the community of Lafayette. We created subsequently a study of the BART block. We looked at what our population would be, and we incorporated uh, some population limits through rezoning of the community in our first general plan, which we adopted in 1970. But there was a high level of participation. I chaired the second commission we created, which we created within a month or two after we incorporated, called the Fire Commission, the Fire Protection Commission. And indeed, a very wonderful group of participants on my commission, the Fire Commission, made the very significant decision within the first 6 months of our incorporation to uh, to liquidate the local fire commission that had been created in 1911 and which was one of our most dearly loved local institutions in favor of consolidating the Lafayette Fire District with the Consolidated Fire District, because we knew after a very methodologically rigorous study that the finances and quality of service from Consolidated would give us a much higher level of fire protection in Lafayette than this local institution to which we had been clinging for years. It was a very tough decision in the city. We created any number of commissions, and the first mega commission we created, the 49ers, which was chaired by Norm Tuttle, who succeeded me when I retired from the fourth council and he was elected to the fifth council. He succeeded me. Norm Tuttle chaired the 49ers, which was comprised of 49 citizens in 7 groups looking at different facets of Lafayette life quality to make recommendations to the Gordon Hall and Associates consulting group that we had engaged in 1968 to work with us to draft our first general plan. And from this first flood of commissions came the Walkways Commission, the Ridgeline Protections Commission, the very highly impactful Sign Commission, where we worked so closely with the Chamber of Commerce, the Youth Commission, inspired by Barbara Bob, on which I served, that engaged teenagers. At one point in Lafayette's early days, we had between 200 and 250 Lafayette residents working on these commissions that
Wow.
defined the city. And that really, going back to your question, and I've spoken at length because there's a lot to be said
Yeah,
about this, that has shaped citizen involvement in Lafayette and has resonated through the generations.
that's wonderful, Bob. Now you were the first head of the first council?
No, even though I was the top vote getter, we had a somewhat controversial start. And I was the third mayor. And then I was again the seventh mayor. So I was mayor of the third council, and I was mayor of the seventh council, counting councils as 2-year periods. I served with a total of 8 other councilmen during my 2 terms.
That's wonderful. So you really have talk about being a public servant. It sounds as though you've really done quite a lot over the years. Um, Let me look at some of these other questions here that we wanted to ask. Um, when you became mayor in 1970 and then again in 74, what were the city's challenges at that time?
Uh, we we got off to a running start. Actually, we got off to a somewhat uh, halting start. We had a couple of um, the council really didn't settle down initially for a little bit. There were some disruptions. This was a very tough time. You're too young to remember this, but uh, when when we incorporated in 1968, we had the founding of the John Birch Society was the year before. We were recovering from the assassinations of 1963-64 and the Republican Convention of 1964, when Nelson Rockefeller, a moderate, was shouted down and not allowed to speak because the audience wanted Barry Goldwater, who is oft quoted in saying, as he did at the convention, extremism in the defense of liberty is not a vice, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing Barry Goldwater. Uh, this was a very disrupted time of the Vietnam War and the demonstrations. The John Birch Society was founded a year before, I think in 1963. We had a candidate who got elected who was active with the John Birch Society. And the first 2 years, we had to deal with a variety of uh, impacts in the community of which I'm very ashamed. We had racism, we had anti-Semitism. Uh, People don't know, I had swastikas painted on my garage door. I had to hire a security service, private security, to protect my family for 6 months when I was the first mayor. At a party celebrating incorporation, we had a community personality who was speaking to an elected first-time councilman and was overheard as saying, I'll vote to disincorporate before I see a kike mayor in this town. So this was a different time, and we had to deal with undercurrents that were today hard to understand and very, very embarrassing. Well, going back to your question, when I became mayor, thinking positively, I felt that we needed to brand Lafayette. We were still just a suburb of the urban core, and somewhere in that area between Berkeley, Oakland, and Walnut Creek, which was burgeoning, I started with the help of John Kennedy of the Chamber of Commerce and the great chamber, Anne Lohr, then chamber executive, the Concours d'Elegance de Lafayette, because I thought that if we could bring a Concours d'Elegance to Lafayette, which had been named for the marquee, that we could begin branding the community as an upscale community, an Epicurean community with tastes. And this was not inconsistent with the BART block idea, where we thought by creating a retail area of boutique shops around our BART station in our urban core, we could attract the Tiffany's. Well, we lost on that one to Walnut Creek, and the BART block, in most respects, given our original vision, didn't happen. But we were branding Lafayette. We were taking advantage of the new sign ordinance that was beautifying downtown. I was thrilled to oversee the opening up of the reservoir to recreation, because the reservoir had been closed to recreation on the water itself until 1970. A very important thing that I was proud of, and I won't take responsibility for, none of us deserve individual responsibility, but in the late 60s, we were receiving community block grants that had no strings attached. Many cities were using these community block grants to pay more to their staff, to pay for new development. Our city, under our first council, made the intelligent decision to set aside our community block grant money and accumulate it over a number of years until we received a sufficient critical mass of those monies so that we could build senior housing, so that people forced out by the cost of living in Lafayette to other communities would have a place in which to remain in Lafayette. So we accumulated monies and built Chateau Lafayette behind the theater for seniors. No other community in this area set aside their monies and husband those monies but to do something like a Chateau Lafayette, of which I'm extremely proud. There were numerous other things. We had uh, uh, when we adopted in 1970 the general plan during my mayoralty, which had been in the works for a couple of years during the fine mayoralty of Don Black and the fine succeeding mayoralty of Gordon Holmes, uh, we uh, looked at our zoning and we created a community whose future growth should be roughly around 25,000. At the time, we were only about maybe 18 or 20,000 people. The county zoning made such huge change. In effect, we downzoned the city uh, so that it would become always a city of plus or minus 25,000 when it grew to its maximum. That I thought was extremely significant for the long-term future of the community. I've gone on.
Well, then let me ask you a question. There is quite a lot of concern today in Lafayette with regard to the many, many condo complexes that we see popping up all over the place and other developments in the works. What are your thoughts? There's concern about that taxing the infrastructure of the roads, the shops, and changing the feel of the town. However, I guess there is some incentive to develop within a mile of the BART, because there's a housing shortage throughout the area. So when you look at all of these things, you seem to be a very good visionary. What do you see for the future of Lafayette?
Well, thank you for that compliment. I have had experience that has shaped my thinking about the importance of thinking regionally. I was Lafayette's first chairman of the county mayor's conference, uh, involving all the cities of the county. I was the Lafayette's first chairman of the Local Agency Formation Commission, which at the time was not only approving or disapproving incorporations of other communities. I was the chair of that commission when we incorporated Moraga. So some people call me uh, one of the parents of Moraga. Uh, I think it's critically important to think regionally. And regionally, what we know is we have a terrible housing shortage. Locally, we also know that density of population creates possibilities for local development that really is the lifeblood of local development. Our downtown would be very different in terms of its potential if there were more pedestrian traffic. So many people walk in and out of shops. And so long as you provide adequate parking, the vitality of a downtown depends hugely on pedestrian traffic and parking. Those are the two main drivers of downtown health. And the health of a small downtown like ours is extremely important to the long-term vitality of the community. So we balance that against the question, can we help our region through the provision of housing affordable to people of all means? And secondly, are there places in Lafayette where we can create that housing that doesn't detract from what we are still as principally a semi-rural community of single-family residences? And my own belief is that we can build the health of a healthy urban core. We're not a Walnut Creek. We never want to be a Walnut Creek or a Pleasant Hill or a Danville or anybody else. We are Lafayette. And what I would just say is that there are many places in the downtown area where multiple dwellings higher density would be very acceptable. Now, that doesn't come without negative effect. Negative effect is principally parking and traffic. We can deal with parking in a number of ways. There are certain ways in which we can deal and improve traffic, but there is a trade-off, and the trade-off is more traffic uh, and more competition for parking. Is it worth it? I think we can create a vital downtown by uh, approving more and more multiples in the downtown center. That doesn't mean that I agree with the development at the east end of town at Acalanes Road and Pleasant Hill Road. Uh, I've always been against that particular zoning for multiples.
Okay. One thing that crosses my mind, I'm a big biker, and Lafayette's the ideal biking community with all the many little flat roads all over the place. And I think we have that wonderful trail, multi-use trail between Lafayette and Moraga. But when you go downtown in Lafayette, it's very difficult to find a place to put your bike. There aren't a lot of, after living in Oakland for many years, where biking is a big, well, there's a very active biking community, and they have been involved in putting these little parking things all over the place for bikes. That is something that crosses my mind, perhaps for the future, that we could make more room, become a little more friendly for people to get out on their bikes, and that would help to alleviate some of the parking pressure. But what are your
You
thoughts
know,
on something like
let, let,
that?
let- what I'll just say to that is that uh, I'm very big on the outdoors, and I'm very big on recreation, and I'm very active still. And I agree with you. We were committed to opening up the reservoir maximally for exercise. We created, and I say this because it goes back to my time, a Walkways Commission. We encouraged neighborhoods to look at assessment districts for putting in sidewalks. We were very supportive of bikeways and bike traffic. Uh, so we have always been believers. That having been said, when you look at Lafayette, we have two major busy roads that are highly congested and one huge intersection at Moraga and Mount Diablo Boulevard. I would not want to do anything on either of those roads that increases congestion or reduces parking. The trade-offs are not worth it. Implication is without affecting traffic or parking where our businesses are and our traffic is heaviest, yes, we should build walkways and provide for biking. And it can be done. People have been very creative about this.
Right. And maybe skipping over some of those big intersections and sticking to roads like
Yes.
Brooks or that kind of thing. Let me ask you, changing the subject here, what would you consider your most important personal contribution in Lafayette?
I don't know if I would select uh, a single thing. Uh, I would say that what I'm most proud of is my values and my support of those values in the people around me who had similar values. Because, again, what I'll say is it wasn't about I or me for any of us, it was about we. Those 9 council people of whom I was one, included one who was a very limited, dogmatic, uh, politically out of sync right winger who thought by grandstanding and appealing to his quotes base, he could do things in Lafayette. And it turned out all he did was marginalize himself and make it difficult for us as a council to do all the good things we wanted to do. And it encouraged a small group, fortunately, a small group of people who were his supporters to be naysayers, snipers. He was voted out after 2 years. He was
Mhm.
thrown out of office.
Mhm.
And that was very important to us. Of the remaining 7, only one had a character defect. And that was because he was politically ambitious. He wanted to be a judge. And so he did things that were wrong. Uh, and we knew who he was, we knew how he was. And most of the time, uh, he was in sync with us with land use planning issues, which were 90% of what we had to deal with. How to improve Lafayette as a living environment, not culturally. 90% of the time, he was not an issue. Uh, and so, what I would say is that of the 9 people in the original council, we had 7 people who were honest, who had integrity, who were devoted to each other, who were diverse in our politics. I was probably the only Democrat who was elected to the city council until Barbara Langlois was elected to the city council. I'm not sure. I don't even know what other people's politics were. Wally Costa may have been a Democrat. But as Don Black and I always agreed, Don was an Oregonian and a lifelong Republican. I was a Minnesotan and a lifelong Democrat. And we agreed that we were interchangeable, totally interchangeable in our politics, so that we were dominated by a moderate, progressive group of people
It's
who
wonderful.
really trusted each other. And what
Mhm.
did that do? What it did was it meant that when people like George Wasson were elected and others were elected, uh, they really were people who continued in that mode. Lafayette never had a history of dysfunction in its city council. We controlled the first 2 years of potential dysfunction, and we controlled the dysfunction that potentially was there. We never had it. We've seen other city councils come apart because
Mhm.
of their dysfunction.
Mhm.
So that's what I'm most proud of.
Thank you. As we end today's wonderful discussion, and again, we are so happy and appreciative that you agreed to share your memories with us today on these important years in Lafayette. The 2040 General Plan for Lafayette will be the blueprint for how and where the city will grow in the future. So, sort of passing the baton. The general plan is in process and will center on community priorities around conservation, development, and a desired balance for Lafayette's social, environmental, and economic values. It sounds as though every few years we probably do this sort of thing. What recommendations would you have for citizens who would like to get involved in the future of Lafayette? Perhaps people who've lived here their whole lives, or maybe newcomers. What are your feelings about civic engagement and the importance of that?
I really don't have anything to add to what I've said before about that, Andrea. I think that I'd be, I'm not, I'm only involved at the fringes of Lafayette now. I only offer my opinion when I'm asked. I've lived in Orinda for a long time. Uh, and so I'm reluctant to comment. What I would say is that I know that the general plan of Lafayette, as updated, will be excellent if there is heavy citizen involvement. And I would be very shocked if there were not heavy citizen involvement, given our history.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great answer. Thank you again so much for this oral history today, and we look forward to seeing it on the Lafayette Historical Society website.